to our multi-part video series exploring the roles and representations of women in video games. This project will examine the tropes, plot devices, and patterns most commonly associated with women in gaming from a systemic, big-picture perspective. This series will include critical analysis of many beloved games and characters, but remember that it's both possible, and even necessary, to simultaneously enjoy media while also being critical of its more problematic or pernicious aspects. So, without further ado, let's jump right into the damsel in distress. One way to think about damsel characters is via what's called the subject-object dichotomy. In the simplest terms, subjects act, and objects are acted upon. The subject is the protagonist, the one who the story is centered on, and the one doing most of the action. In video games, this is almost always the main playable character, and the one from whose perspective most of the story is seen. So the damsel trope typically makes men the subject of narratives, while relegating women to the role of object. This is a form of objectification because as objects, damseled women are being acted upon, most often becoming or reduced to a prize to be won, a treasure to be found, or a goal to be achieved.
Or a loved one who needs to be saved. As Thunderfoot suggested, it could very well be possible that these men are selflessly going out of their way at the risk of their own lives, because they care about the woman they are saving and would rather see them safe and sound as opposed to captured and in danger. You see, Anita attributes a very specific kind of motivation behind these male characters, without leaving much room to examine other possible intentions. She considers the concern and desire to help a loved one or friend in need as an act of objectification, which is a very unusual interpretation because in order to avoid objectification, the male leads would need to forget about the damsels and instead leave her to her fate. By Anita's logic, this would show respect towards their personal agency, regardless of the consequence.
The hero's fight to retrieve his stolen property then provides the lazy justification for the actual gameplay. At its heart, the damsel trope is not really about women at all. She simply becomes the central object in a competition between men, at least in its traditional incarnations. I've heard it said that in the game of patriarchy, women are not the opposing team, they are the ball. So for example, we can think of the Super Mario franchise as a grand game being played between Mario and Bowser, and Princess Peach's role is essentially that of the ball.
Anita once again imposes a very particular interpretation of the motives surrounding the men who rescue the damsels. She assumes the only real reason a man would want to keep a woman he loves or cares about safe is to instill a sense of ownership over her, as opposed to any legitimate goodwill he has in wanting to see her safe and away from harm. By this logic, Helen Ripley was not fighting the Queen Ilian to keep Newt safe, but rather to fortify her ownership of Newt. I'm curious to see if Anita Sarkeesian's interpretation would still hold if the genders were reversed. If I was a betting man, I would bet hell no.
The pattern of presenting women as fundamentally weak, ineffective, or ultimately incapable.
A small note. Just because someone is captured or put into a situation they cannot easily escape, it doesn't necessarily mean that person is weak, incapable, or ineffective. It's fine if that's what Anita thinks, but ultimately it's just her opinion.
Has larger ramifications beyond the characters themselves and the specific games they inhabit.
Unless Anita can point to a peer-reviewed study on these so-called ramifications, this statement stands as nothing more than a personal opinion. It would be nice if Anita could stop positing her personal beliefs as declarative facts.
We have to remember that these games don't exist in a vacuum. They are an increasingly important and influential part of our larger social and cultural ecosystem. The reality is, this trope is being used in a real-world context where backward sexist attitudes are already rampant.
How is this being used in a real-world context, and where exactly are these rampaging sexist attitudes being displayed? Is there a site or some fan page she has where all this evidence is being stored?
It's a sad fact that a large percentage of the world's population still clings to the deeply sexist belief that women as a group need to be sheltered, protected, and taken care of by men.
Well, she will be happy to learn that we don't view it as a responsibility unique to men anymore. These days, we view it as a responsibility of the government.
The belief that women are somehow a naturally weaker gender is a deeply ingrained, socially constructed myth, which of course is completely false.
What the fuck are you talking about?
But the notion is reinforced and perpetuated when women are continuously portrayed as frail, fragile, and vulnerable creatures.
What happened to me, and sadly to other women as well, can best be described as a cyber mob. And whether it's a cyber mob or a handful of hateful comments, the end result is maintaining and reinforcing and normalizing a culture of sexism, where men who harass are supported by their peers and rewarded for their sexist attitudes and behaviors, and where women are silenced, marginalized, and excluded from full participation.
Just to be clear, I'm not saying that all games that use the damsel in distress as a plot device are automatically sexist or have no value. But it's undeniable that popular culture is a powerful influence in our lives, and the damsel in distress trope as a recurring trend does help to normalize extremely toxic, patronizing, and paternalistic attitudes about women.
No, actually, that would be feminism, VAWA, now, and oddly enough, you.
The good news is that there's nothing stopping developers from evolving their gender representations and making more women heroes in their future games.
Or, and just stay with me here, nothing stopping women from becoming more involved in game development and making games which appeal to their feminine sensibilities. Hasn't this entire video been about the plight of women being denied their own agency? And yet, instead of encouraging women to become active subjects to solve their own lack of representation in gaming, you put the pressure on current game developers to ride in on their noble steeds and evolve women's roles, which not only undermines every argument you've made in this video, but also makes you a huge hypocrite for expecting someone else to solve women's problems for them. Methinks you need to rewatch your own video again.
Okay, so we've established that the damsel in distress trope is one of the most widely used gendered cliches in the history of video games, and has been core to the popularization and development of gaming as a medium.
Not really, actually. Your entire video consisted of nothing more than a personal argument, none of which had any data or studies to support it. Granted, you are entitled to an opinion, but I have to wonder why any of this required more than $100,000. Your video has received refutations from people with more informed and qualified opinions at less than a fraction of the cost of your video series. Now, I don't want to accuse Anita of being an intellectually dishonest con artist, but, well, I'll reserve